Hello, everyone. This is Mark Newson from Stanford University, and welcome to the next session of the B2K Guide to the Fundamentals of Data Science. It's a real pleasure to introduce a speaker for today, who is Michel Dumontier from Stanford University. Michel is an associate professor of biomedical informatics at Stanford. Before he was at Stanford, he was at Carleton University in Canada, and has had a long career in semantic technology, and is the co-chair of the W3C Healthcare and Life Sciences Interest Group, where he's had enormous impact on the field in developing approaches to using semantic technology in the biomedical applications. The idea of ontology obviously is very old and dates way back to the Greek philosophers, but in the past 20 to 30 years has had an enormous impact on the field of big data, and Michel will be talking about that. Michel.
Great, thank you very much, Mark, for that introduction. Thank you also for the organizers to give me the opportunity to sort of share my thoughts on ontologies, and I hope that throughout this presentation, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box, and we'll try to address them at the end. So for today's talk, I'm hoping to tell you a little bit about what ontologies are and why we should perhaps be using them. A little bit about building and reasoning over ontologies, and then some applications in biomedicine. So what is an ontology? Well, ontology stands for logical discourse of existence, and the real goal of ontology is to uncover and describe the nature and structure of things. It's been, as Mark said, predominantly the domain of philosophy. It's a very long history in the field of metaphysics, and it's been associated with, prominent philosophers such as Plato and Aristotle. In the case of Plato, he mostly focused on what he called forms, which they were kind of conceptual. They could be of any kind of thing and not really or necessarily tied to reality. Whereas Aristotle focused on an empirical kind of analysis where the types of things that we see are really as a result of what what actually exists, what currently exists. So ontology, the study of ontology, attempts to address questions such as what does it mean to be, what constitutes the identity of an object, and what categories can we sort existing things into. And as this field has developed, I think the principal idea is that ontologies, particularly when they're communicated to others, foster a shared understanding of things, the nature of things, and their structures and relationships. So early bio-ontologists do include Aristotle in 4th century BC, 3rd century BC, where he made many contributions to the field of ontology, and also provided for systematic taxonomy of biology. The classifications of organisms were typically by some shared properties, and used this binomial nomenclature that focused on Genus-differentia. And I'll talk a little bit about that. Galen is another also very famous individual that focused on medical applications and medical ontology for the systematic description of diseases, signs, and symptoms. And he also used this Aristotelian genus-differential approach. So what is this? Well, this approach is really key, I think, to building good ontologies. It's a kind of intentional definition where you do provide the necessary and sufficient conditions in the definition. And you can see the definitions are composed of two parts. The first is the genus, which serves as the basis for a new definition, and basically all definitions that contain this genus component are considered to be members of that genus. And then the other component is some differentia, something that tells you a little bit more specifically about what differentiates this type of thing from any other type. So for instance, if you have, say, a type like a rhombus, you can define it as a quadrilateral. So the quadrilateral part is the genus, and of course that would be defined elsewhere, but you're using it as a basis to form your own definition here. And the particulars of the rhombus is that it has bounding sides which all have the same length. And so we can build on that to define a square. We can say a square is a rhombus, so it inherits the properties that we've described above. And it also has interior angles, which are all right angles. So in this way, when we build ontologies, we can, in this way, we can sort of navigate it almost like a binary decision tree. You can look at the properties and see if it fits, and continue down that branch, or perhaps go down a different branch based on that structure. So for instance, for Aristotle's categories, the main object type was substance, or one of the more important ones was substance. And then you had a differentia, which would be, for instance, whether the object was material or immaterial. If it was immaterial, it was a kind of spirit. If it was material, it was a kind of body. And then you had two other differentia, where you would look whether the body was inanimate, in which case it would be a kind of mineral. And if it was animate, it would be living. And similarly for living, you'd look, is it sensitive or insensitive? And if it was sensitive, it was an animal. And then from an animal, you would look at whether it was rational or irrational, and that would lead you eventually to the category of human. And then from which individuals that exist in the world would instantiate this category, and would basically, we would infer that humans were rational, sensitive, animate, and material substances. Biologists have a long history of trying to do classification, and of course this example is no better known than in biological taxonomy, where we have different kinds of categories to describe the different living organisms that we see in the world today. One of the three main kingdoms is animals, for instance, and these are divided into phylum, into classes, orders, families, genus, and species. This is, while there are other different kinds of ranks for the classification, these are the main ones. And you can see that, at least in this diagram, how it is simply articulated, the differentia, to go from from the parent categories into more specific categories. So for instance, for animals, they are organisms that are able to move on their own. Chordates are animals with a backbone. Mammals are chordates with fur or hair and milk glands, and so on, all the way up to Homo sapiens. So this basically instantiates a kind of taxonomy where we have a hierarchy of inheritance, where you have an is-our relationship, that every instance of a chordate is also an instance of an animal, and so on. So we can really see this kind of, this structure, this taxonomic structure, where you have an is-a relationship that holds between one set of objects and another set of objects. And so you can see on the right-hand side this kind of illustration that the entities that are considered to be mammals are also considered to be chordates. But chordates are not only, don't only necessarily contain mammals, but could contain other kinds of species. And similar with animals, chordates are kinds of animals, but then there could also be other kinds of animals present. So moving from this more, this early understanding or development of ontology, there's been this increasing trend to, I guess in some sense, operationalize ontology, to make it, to apply it into computational contexts. And this has been, as Mark said, an evolution over the past, 30, 40, 50 years, where people have been thinking a little bit more about what does it mean to apply these kinds of categorical systems to things, and how do we use them. So Tom Gruber is also a very important individual in this context. He was one of the developers or inventors of the Siri application, which you can use on the iPhone. And he put forward that an ontology was an explicit specification of a conceptualization. So let's break that down. So conceptualization is the way that we think about the domain, something that we can articulate to others. And the specification is some way of writing that down. Borst in '97 sort of extended this to say, so let's focus on that, and let's say a formal specification. And again, formal in the sense that you have a formal language which you can use to describe the specification in an unambiguous way. And you also specify that it should be a shared conceptualization. So it's not sufficient that you just articulate it with a formal language, but that the definitions and meanings that you have are shared amongst different groups. And then Gruber came back a little bit later, and again, we have a much more pragmatic approach to the description of ontology, where he says an ontology specifies a vocabulary with which to make assertions, which may be inputs and outputs of knowledge agents, for instance, a software program. But ultimately, that an ontology must be formulated in some representational language. So these kinds of requirements are a little bit different than what we might see for other kinds of classification systems. So for instance, in a folksonomy, which we're very accustomed to when we're tagging, for instance, images or we're making annotations of some kind, we use some collection of terms to enhance the overall ability to navigate through different kinds of content, but it's not necessarily really formally organized. It's mostly loosely coupled with our intuition about what those terms mean. And in some cases, people can use synonyms for exactly the same concept. So there's not much constraint here. In contrast, so a glossary really provides both the terms and some definition and potential explanations or examples of use. A controlled vocabulary would focus more on some enumeration of terms that are defined so that they can specifically be shared and reused. And so communities would adopt some particular set of terms and sort of ensure that these are well understood by members of the community and used in a coherent manner. And then going back to hierarchies, again, are just a nested set of terms, but the relation between one term and another can vary. So for instance, in a proper taxonomy, you would expect to use this is-a relationship, right? So every mammal is a kind of animal, but in a meronymy, then this relationship is a part of relationship, right? So you would have, for instance, the arm would be part of the of the body or something like that. And finally, a classification, in which ontologies typically are, is a set of categories in which objects are grouped into, what you can sort, add, for instance, data into, or any other thing. So why do we want to develop an ontology? Well, primarily, there are a few different main use cases. The first is to provide a formal specification of biomedical knowledge, something that we can represent in a way that is relatively unambiguous, that both people and agents can understand and consume and use in some way. One of those ways is that they can do this classification task by looking at the definitions or looking at the differentia and trying to apply them to, for instance, data. We use them to develop a common understanding of the kinds of entities in a given domain and the relationships that exist between them. And we use them to enable reuse of data and knowledge in different contexts. And ultimately, in our case, for many of us in this community that are listening to this webinar, is we try to use ontologies to enable biomedical discovery. So one of the most famous and well-known ontologies in the biomedical domain is the gene ontology. There are millions of annotations on hundreds of thousands of genes that use the gene ontology terms. The gene ontology defines types that are used to describe gene function, and it basically has three main categorical aspects. The first is molecular function, so what do gene products do? The second is cellular component, which is where are the gene products, where do they operate? And finally, there's a biological process branch, which describes the pathways and the processes that gene products participate in. And so on the right-hand side, you can see this is a snapshot from the Amigo tool of the gene ontology. It has this nested hierarchy following the is-a relationships, as denoted with the I. And you can see, so from biological process branch, one of the subtypes is behavior. And you can see next to it, the numeric label indicates the number of gene products that have been annotated with that label, with that biological process. So as you navigate further down the tree, there will be a narrowing of the total number of instances that can be applied. But in total, there are 800,000 at least reported on the Amigo website. So what's interesting about the gene ontology is it's in essence, it was formulated to handle a problem where many different biological databases were crafting their own terms to annotate the genes and to provide them with a functional description. And so the Gene Ontology Consortium came together to establish a common vocabulary that could be used independently of species. And so on the bottom chart, you can see the distribution of annotations across different species, for instance, from human and mouse and rat. In that chart, it also shows the distribution in terms of where those annotations have experimental evidence or non-experimental evidence. So the vast majority are somewhat imputed from computational means, but human proteins and mice proteins are very well studied. Now, in preparation for this talk, I also looked up one of the proteins that I had worked on very early in my career, which was on RAC1A GTPase. And so in Uniprot, that's one of our protein databases, also includes gene ontology annotations for protein products. And in our work, we looked at, through mutational perturbations, we looked at what RAC1 GTPases could be doing. And we saw that they control filopodia formation, cell motility, endocytosis, cytokinesis, and development in slime molds. And so these descriptions, these functional descriptions, are captured using gene ontology terms. And as I mentioned, so certainly in the case here for RAC1A, it's basically a protein kinase. It has GTP binding activity. And so if we want to see what are all the proteins that have GTP binding, we can do that, and we can see there's a wide distribution across all the different species. So this is the big win for an ontology like the gene ontology, is to see that no matter what kind of biological organism you are, you can use the terms that are defined in a consistent manner in your own biological annotation projects. Now, clearly, the gene ontology on its own is a necessary development in the description of gene products, but we also need similar terminologies across the biological scales to describe the different kinds of proteins, the different kinds of organelles, the different kinds of cells and tissues and organs and organisms altogether, as we saw with the natural taxonomy. So some disease and phenotypes ontologies, there are key healthcare terminologies, and these are provided through the UMLS system, where we have terminologies like SNOMED-CT for clinical terminology, diseases, diagnostics, and procedures, the NCI thesaurus, which is a pretty wide-ranging vocabulary for clinical care, translational and basic research, public information administration activities, LOINC for labs and vital signs, and ICD 9 and 10 for disease epidemiology and billing. Other efforts have also complemented these ones in the Open Biomedical Ontology Consortium, including the disease ontology, which offers a standardized ontology for human disease. These are mapped to these UMLS terminologies. And it's complemented with the human phenotype ontology that provides phenotypic descriptions for human, hereditary, and now many other diseases. And the mammalian phenotype ontology complements the human one by being a little bit more broad than just human phenotypes and encompassing and have been widely used in different kinds of phenotyping experiments, for instance, for mice and rats and so on. And finally, an experimental factor ontology from the European Bioinformatics Institute, which takes in all of these different kinds of ontologies and tries to provide support for discovery in the context of many different kinds of experimental data sets. So where can you go and get ontologies? Well, Mark Musin is the PI for the bioportal. It currently contains 517 biomedical ontologies and over 7.8 million classes. So it's obviously an enormous number of ontologies. It's a great resource for biomedical researchers. Allows you to search these UMLS ontologies as well as the open biomedical ontologies and many more. There are other repositories of ontologies and vocabularies. One of these is the Linked Open Vocabularies effort. This is really largely focused around ontologies and terminologies to describe data using semantic web standards, for instance, a resource description framework, but are widely used outside of that as well. All right, so what I'd like to do now is just give you a quick introduction, I guess, to more of the idea of how do we formalize our conceptualizations, how do we build computable ontologies and reason with them, and then follow up with applications. So this, again, this idea of formalization is the process by which we map our conceptualization. What are the kinds of entities that exist in the domain? What are the relationships and their attributes into some kind of logical representation? And we can kind of see that our logical representations are essentially a set of building blocks in which we can combine them to create machine understandable expression that have an unambiguous interpretation, and therefore we can automatically reason about them. So again, the idea is that we have concepts that we can reuse in different contexts and create new expressions. So for instance, description logics is one of these languages that we can use to build ontologies. And we can define something, for instance, like a transcription factor as being a kind of protein that binds to DNA molecules and regulates the rate of transcription. So this is an expression that we can describe in description logics. And therefore, we can ask questions about things that bind to DNA or things that regulate the rate of transcription. And we would discover that transcription factors satisfy these. So one of the languages that we have available to build ontologies is the OWL, which stands for the Web Ontology Language. It is a product of the World Wide Web Consortium and has gone through a couple of different iterations now, and it's the de facto standard for building computable ontologies on the semantic web. There are many other languages that are available, of course, with all kinds of interesting properties, and which may be better suited for particular projects, but this is the one that I'll focus on here. So one of the challenges of, again, this formalization process is now you really have to think about what you are saying to a machine. That now it matters how you describe something, because the interpretation may be erroneous to us if we don't correctly capture it in the first place. So OWL specifies a vocabulary and a grammar to express more precisely what we mean when we are describing entities of interest. It provides us with the ability to articulate different kinds of things or classes, the relations or properties, and to describe even data, so individuals and their specific values. So different kinds of aspects of the language, briefly. Disjointness, where we want to know whether things are the same or different from one another. We can quantify our relationships, so we can say, for instance, that if we wanted to define the class of parents, we would expect that a parent would have at least one child. And so we have this range that we can quantify over some relationship. We have a vocabulary for negation, where we can say something it's not the case. So for instance, that we can say that penguins are kinds of birds, but they do not fly, for instance. We also have aspects that relate to disjunction, so basically the ability to express a union, and a variety of different property characteristics for automated reasoning. So for instance, for transitivity, for inferring functional properties or inverse functional properties and symmetric properties, and so on. And there's a few other aspects that are like complex class expressions and property chains that are very useful, but probably more seldomly used. So what do we get with reasoning over OWL ontologies? Well, there's a number of different properties of a number of different aspects that we can use. The first is consistency, where we can determine whether an ontology contains contradictions. There's satisfiability, where we can determine whether classes can have instances or whether they're logically basically unsatisfiable, that no instances could ever fulfill the description that's provided because it's logically inconsistent. We can compute subsumption, where we're asking, are instances of one class also instances of another class? Do they satisfy those minimal requirements? We can perform classification, where we repeatedly apply subsumption to discover links between named classes. And finally, we can perform realization, where if we have individuals in our knowledge base, we can see if they are members of classes that are defined in the ontology. So we can use tools like Protégé, which is also developed by Mark, to construct OWL ontologies. It implements the OWL standard, and it's extensible. People have been writing plugins, so there's a wonderful software framework to build on and exploit ontologies that are being built. I show a screenshot in the lower hand side where, again, I designed a quick and dirty ontology just to describe that proteins have amino acids as their part, and they're also types of molecules. So this, can be done very quickly, very readily. There are also other products on the market to build ontologies, including, for instance, Top Rate Composer, which offers this graphical interface. But they both share this very common view, where you have this tree-like view of the different classes and a description of their properties, the attributes. Right, so just a quick focus here on the Protégé editor. You can see this is the layout. So we have on the upper left-hand side the class hierarchy, organic molecule, and we have proteins that are types, subclasses of organic molecules, and amino acids that are also subclasses of organic molecules. And in the lower left panel, you can see a property that we have defined, which is the has part. And so this, now we have our terminology in our domain, which is the different kinds of objects that we're interested in, organic molecules, proteins, amino acids, and a relation to help relate these to any of the two or more entities of interest, which is has part. So in the lower right-hand side, you can craft these logical expressions to describe the relationships that exist between these entities. So for instance, now we're focused on the protein entity. We have two subclass axioms. The first is that, so we have that every protein is a kind of organic molecule, and so that forms the genus of our definition. And then secondly, that that proteins are comprised or have amino acids as part. So that's our differentia. And so the Protégé editor offers this autocomplete service that helps you craft these OWL, these syntactically correct OWL expressions. So this is just, again, this is easy enough for everybody to do, to go to the Protégé website, to download the tool, to start playing around with ontologies and reasoners. One of the ontologies that we have built is the Semantic Science Integrated Ontology, or SIO, and it captures many of the different basic kinds of things in the domain, and divides up the world into three aspects: objects and processes and their attributes. And then we can create even more sophisticated expressions for each of the basic biomedical data types of interest. So here I show you the hierarchy that relates to that goes all the way down to a protein. And there are other ontologies out there that provide descriptions of proteins and other kinds of biomolecules. But suffice to say that because we have also added these axioms into the ontology, we can ask questions that are not just about to retrieve the label, like use the labels of things to retrieve the types of things of interest. But we can actually use the axiom. We can ask whether or not, for instance, what are all the things that have amino acid residues as a part? And we get protein, of course, as one of our answers, polypeptides, enzymes, antibodies, protein complexes. And amino acid residues are themselves, by definition, are wholly themselves. So you also see another term there, which is OWL nothing, and the Protégé editor by default shows you that that the subclass of all things is nothing. So it's just an artifact of the language. Okay, so in the last bit, what I hope to do is talk to you about a couple of different applications in biomedicine to give you a sense of what we and others are doing in this domain. And by no means is this comprehensive. There's a vast body of work, and hopefully you'll see more of it in the seminar series. But here's a few different applications that I want to bring to your attention. So SNOMED-CT is one of these ontologies that are used in the healthcare domain. It's used across many different countries and by many providers in the United States. It provides common vocabulary for recording clinical data, and it's comprised of about 324,000 classes. So it's a huge ontology. And on the right-hand side, you can see a sort of snapshot of part of SNOMED-CT towards the upper level. So there are body structures, clinical findings, organisms, pharmaceuticals, procedures, and so on. Lots of different things in there. Now, SNOMED-CT uses a pattern-based knowledge capture, so they really want to express the features of each of the categories that you see there. But you can see the expression is very difficult to parse. You have to pretty much be trained in this, but the idea is that once you adopt a kind of pattern for defining your genus or your differentia, then you can actually automatically construct and validate the ontology. So we'll show you an example here where Kaiser Permanente had done some work to extend SNOMED to express some different kinds of categories, in particular non-viral pneumonia, in which, again, here this term contains an element of negation. You're looking for things that are not viral. And infectious pneumonia, which would be caused by a virus or bacterium. So here you have a disjunctive clause. Double pneumonia, which occurs in two lungs. So you're using this cardinality description. In an implementation of this called SNOMED-OWL, you can express these kinds of definitions. And when you use an automated reasoner, what's interesting is that it failed to find some of the expected subsumptions. For instance, that bacterial pneumonia is a kind of non-viral pneumonia. And part of the reason is that the ontology was under-constrained. It didn't know the ontology. We didn't provide the reasoner information that said that virus and bacterium are not the same things, which are required to make the entailment. But adding disjointness in these concepts led to other results from the reasoner. And for instance, that one of the classes that became inconsistent is this cutaneous embolization of hepatic artery using fluoroscopy guidance. And the cause of this inconsistency, which you can learn by asking the reasoner to provide you with some justification for the inconsistency, is that there was a problem in the description of groin, which was asserted to be a subclass of both an abdomen and a leg. And these are disjoint in the ontology. And so this results in the total, like a huge amount of inconsistency in the ontology. So the nice thing about using a language like OWL, a formal language, along with the reasoner, is that when you're making these kinds of statements, when you're providing the descriptions that at least provide necessary conditions, if not sufficient conditions, it can find those expressions that are contradictory to one another. Another increasingly, just like we saw with the gene ontology, where we're using an ontology for annotation of genes, we also use, for instance, phenotype ontologies to do deep clinical phenotyping of patients. So here, this is one tool called Phenotypes, which uses the human phenotype ontology to provide descriptions of human patients. And so it provides you the ability to navigate to basically an easier navigation of the ontology itself, but the ability to sort of say that, for instance, a patient has or does not have a specific signs or symptoms of some disorder, and provides a sort of a computable representation of this description. This kind of information, this deep clinical phenotyping used in ontologies, can be used to match patients together. So PhenoCentral is one of these portals that can be used to find patients that match the one that you're looking at or that you've characterized. So you'll have a set of phenotypes for your patient, And through measures of semantic similarity, you're going to try to find patients that are most like this one. And in this tool, because it's focused on rare diseases, the idea is to find other patients that share similar phenotypes and potentially share the same disease etiology. And so there's the opportunity to communicate with other providers that know something about these patients. Another application here of using phenotypic ontologies or disease ontologies is to pinpoint, more accurately pinpoint the genetic basis for disorders. So in this work here for Phenex, where once you collect genomic information about a patient coupled with this deep clinical phenotyping and modeling it or looking at the different disorders that have been described in, for instance, the Orphanet or OMIM or ClinVar, it becomes possible to prioritize the set of genes that come up from some variant analysis coupled with the phenotypic profile to identify the genes that are most likely to be responsible for eliciting the phenotypes that we observe. So this has been applied and has helped to identify individuals with fairly rare disorders. They occur very infrequently, but the fact that we have these descriptions allow us to identify candidate genes. All right, so finally what I want to do is just tell you about some of the work that we have been doing where we use ontologies for drug discovery. So one of the projects that we did was to identify human drug targets using the phenotypes from knockout mice models and the basically the effects of the side effects of known drugs. And so the main idea here is that if we can compare the phenotypes of knockout mouse models with the effects of drugs, that when they are similar, it would suggest that the drug might be an inhibitor of that gene, which produces that phenotypic profile. So to do this kind of experiment, though, the problem is that drugs are and their effects are expressed using MedDRA or UMLS terminology. This is from one of the databases called CIDR, which basically does text mining using ontologies over structured product labels. And we also have phenotypes from the mouse genome database, which are expressed using the mammalian phenotype ontology. So we basically have now the problem that we have like apples and oranges. On the one hand, we have mammalian phenotypes, and then on the other hand, we have drug effects. But they're not using the same vocabulary. So it's hard to do the comparison between, for instance, a drug side effect profile and a mouse model phenotypic profile. So what we have to do at that point is create mappings or a correspondence between the different terminologies. And this is really what mappings are used for, to establish a correspondence between one term and another term from different vocabularies. And so this allows us to have a common, when we can map one set of terms to another, it allows us then to compare apples with apples again. And so we use measures of what we call semantic similarity to compare a list of, for instance, drug effects with a list of mice model phenotypes. And then we can, looking at the intersection over their union, we can assign a score that says just how similar those profiles are to one another. So when we do that, when we compute the similarity between drugs and their effects and mice models and their phenotypes, what we find is that we can in fact recover drug targets in this way pretty accurately, in a way that's fairly surprising. That phenotypic information about the effects of knocking out genes in mice often look like the effects that we see in drugs as well that target those genes. So when we do our comparison against DrugBank, which is a database of known drug targets, we get a ROC AUC of 0.72. And when we look for human targets in another database called Stitch, which is both manually curated and automatically derived drug targets, we do slightly better. And we do the best for when we're trying to identify mice targets. But our success varies depending on the receptor type or the target type. So one of the interesting findings is that we can, by doing this, we can also pinpoint multiple physiological targets of these drugs. So for instance, for diclofenac, which is a non-steroidal agent, is used to treat pain, osteoarthritis, and rheumatoid arthritis. What we find is that 46% of the effects of the drug can be explained by a COX-2 knockout, which has features like inflammation, gastritis, constipation, upper GI tract pain. And the other roughly 50% can be explained by knockout to PPARG. This regulates metabolism, proliferation, inflammation, and differentiation. So these genes, when they're knocked out, they give you a, and this is the whole basis for a lot of biology, which is this perturbation to uncover gene function. They tell you what roles that they're participating in, and we can sort of see that in terms of when the drugs are also inhibiting those genes. Okay, so in summary, I know that this was a kind of a quick run through ontology. Obviously, there's much more to ontology, but I think here the hope is to describe to you in a way that hopefully you get some sense of the different tensions that we have in building ontologies by considering the many contributions of the field of philosophy of metaphysics to understanding the world and the kinds of things that exist and what relationships hold between them. There are many formal theories of ontology that we try to implement in practice using formal languages like OWL and others. And primarily, OWL again is one of our de facto languages. It's extremely powerful, but it's also very easy to get wrong. And so when you're building the ontology, the only way that you can find that you made an error is if your ontologies are sufficiently expressive, you've made an attempt to, again, formalize these differentia between the different classes. And then the reasoner will do a lot of hard work for you to try to find inconsistencies in those descriptions. What I hope I've convinced you is that ontologies have a wide variety of biomedical uses. From basic answering of questions. This is one of big motivations from again a shared understanding of these different terms, that if you ask questions you get answers for them in the way that you expected them, but then also that they have a role to play in data integration and in a variety of biomedical knowledge discovery settings. Okay, so I want to acknowledge a number of individuals. I have shamelessly stolen and adapted slides from leaders in the field, including Mark Musin, who's here at Stanford, Barry Smith, who's at the University of Buffalo, a preeminent philosopher in the field of biomedical ontology in particular, Ian Horrocks, who one of the architects for the web ontology language, Robert Hundorf, a collaborator of mine where we do this drug discovery work using ontologies, Melissa Handel, who is working on integration of genotype-phenotype descriptions across species in her Monarch initiative, and Paul Schofield, who has also been contributing to that and many other things. All right, and with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Michel. That was fantastic. Again, everyone who has questions should type their questions into the chat. With this many people on the call, if we were to unmute everyone, the background noise would be terrible. So please put your questions into the chat box, and we'll try to get to them in order. While people are typing, let me ask you a question, Michel. One of the tensions that we feel in the big data community is a question about whether ontologies are even worth it. That means there's this undercurrent that ontologies are large, they're hard to build, they're hard to maintain. Can't we just learn all the distinctions that we need from data? And is it possible that the advent of the big data revolution will make ontologies less important? Curious what thoughts you might have about that.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Mark. There are increasing numbers of attempts to build data-driven ontologies. Trey Eiderker published a paper, I think a couple of years ago now. I think it was called Nexo, where he was trying to learn the cellular compartments, or basically the part of the gene ontology dealing with cellular components, from interaction data. So in some sense, some of the relationships that we see in ontologies, the things that we know and the relations that hold to them, should be evidenced in the data that we are collecting. The problem is, of course, that what we often use ontologies for is this communication between individuals about the terms that they use and what they mean, and frankly, science is constantly changing, right? Our understanding of the basic kinds of things and what they do is always changing. Annotations about proteins versus functional descriptions of proteins are being added and also retracted, and they need to be evidenced by experiments. And it seems to me that the value of having again a consistent set of terms to use for annotation, which fundamentally enables the kinds of computations that we do, I don't think that people who only, for instance, use text mine compound nouns or anything like that would be able to find the same kinds of things that we do when we have these structured annotations. Text mining itself is hugely enhanced by having terminologies to use, and that includes capturing all the different kinds of synonyms and in various languages. So it seems like we will always need, at least for the foreseeable future, an involvement of humans to ensure the accuracy of the kinds of things that we're interested in, and particularly to provide this query answering capability. Of course, I'm shown to be, also even that is being challenged by systems like Watson that are capable of learning associations between different terms and to answer simple questions, or questions like on the Jeopardy challenge that we saw. But even Watson uses structured terminologies. So it seems like, it's some combination thereof. And I think those are going to be, the most successful projects are going to think a little bit about how far can we go with data, and then do we need some extra input from humans because the data just isn't sufficient to do the task that we're looking for.
You raise an interesting issue, Michel, and that is that science changes. Suddenly you learn that you can have reverse transcriptase and you can make DNA from RNA, or sometimes you find out that Pluto is no longer a planet. Given the fact that the world changes, how do you know whether your ontologies are actually still valid? You mentioned that SNOMED is more than 300,000 terms. How do you know where the bugs are?
Yeah, that's I think where ontology meets some software engineering, right? I think we're increasingly seeing, and we use this in our own ontology development, these patterns where we can instantiate class descriptions in some regular way. And by doing that, we know that we can check the consistency of the knowledge that we're authoring. And I think that scales to really big ontologies. It used to be, 10 years ago, it was enormously challenging to reason about a very large ontology like SNOMED. And today, you can do it in, extremely short periods of time. It's entirely feasible to do. The problem, I think, the bigger problem is the fact that we have 500 ontologies, right? There's so many to choose from. They are partially overlapping. They're also possibly incomplete with the domain because of the changes, right, or our understanding. And so if you start, using one ontology and another one comes in that is, potentially, applicable for you, how do you make sense of that? How do you use multiple ontologies and not, confuse everybody about what it is that you're doing or how to use this in some computational way? So I think this is one of the next great challenges, is making sense of the 500 plus ontologies in BioPortal in a way that users that are trying to do their task, which let's say is annotation or analysis, are pretty much like, they don't need to worry about all of this other stuff. But getting to that point, I think, still poses a significant challenge for all of us.
Yeah, I agree. A questioner is asking, how do developers of ontologies get feedback from the communities that use them? And is there any kinds of standards or tools that can facilitate that kind of feedback?
My understanding is so if you go to BioPortal, for instance, is that you'll see metadata about the ontologies, which includes often includes the homepage for the ontology, but more and more of these ontology-based efforts have some kind of mailing list or discussion forum, as well as issue trackers. Some of these things are, for instance, foundational principles in the open biomedical ontology community. People can make suggestions for new terms, they can suggest revisions, and so on. However, again, there's no guarantee that your terms that you're suggesting are going to be incorporated. People have vigorous debates about the definition of things, and this certainly happens in the healthcare terminology setting, whether it's ICD or SNOMED or whatnot. This pits people against each other, trying to figure out what exactly are we talking about here, and which, if we do this, is it pragmatic for the users of these ontologies? So that tension is always there, but I think the biggest thing, and something that I encourage everybody, is that when you see something not quite working the way that you had hoped, that I think at this point we're sort of beyond the bonanza, the wild west of ontology building with so many now. Now it's really going to be about refinement and hopefully some consolidation, right? Some ability for us to have a coherent view of all of these ontologies that is maximally useful for all users.
A questioner points out that there's another ontology language called OBO and wonders how that's different from OWL and why is there more than one language for building ontologies?
Yeah, so OBO, one of the early benefits of OBO is a very simple language, again, to capture these basic definitions of, so human readable labels, definitions, synonyms, had been extended to contain, again, the ability to do this hierarchical organization and descriptions of the kinds of relationships. And some work, I think maybe 7 years ago or something, was to then map languages like OBO to the web ontology language. So there is a formal now semantic to OBO. It mirrors what we see in OWL, and so OBO is like now a syntax that can express the OWL axioms that you might generate, and vice versa. Again, from the perspective of language development, there are many languages. Of course, I only touched on one. There are many more expressive languages than OWL. There are lots of reasons to choose a different kind of language, but frankly, this is a standard from the W3C, and just like how HTML provided a generic platform for us to read web pages with a single browser. We can browse the whole internet using, or a very large part of the internet using that. What we don't want to see is languages that don't interoperate with one another. So what I get the sense of is that new languages or new developments are building on these formally defined semantics, providing a correspondence between different languages, and then in that way we extend our capacity to express different kinds of constructs.
Is there a standard ontology database endorsed by NIH that allows conversion between disparate resources, and would BioPortal potentially be it?
Yeah, I don't know, Mark, is it?
I don't know. Well, I don't think NIH necessarily goes around endorsing standards, but I think BioPortal probably would be it, in as much as it is the resource that contains all the publicly available ontologies in biomedicine, whereas other resources tend to be more selective. So in some sense, I think BioPortal might be that resource, but I think it's really up to what users need and what their applications require.
Yeah, I mean, there are other ontology repositories. The European Bioinformatics Institute have an ontology repository. There's this Ontobi ontology repository, the Aber-OWL ontology repository, and then there's a variety of ontology repositories that go beyond the biomedical scope, like the Tones one, and so on. So there's a smattering of different ontology repositories. Many of them are drawing from the source code, like repositories where these ontologies are stored. They offer some kind of both archival and or change view functionality. So I think it's just a matter of looking at them and seeing what works for you.
Okay. Are many people conversant or skilled in using multiple ontologies? I'm not sure if that's a question about the workforce or a training question, or what's necessary to actually conduct work in this area. Is there much work to be done in the mapping between ontologies? Maybe those are two questions.
Okay, so the first question pertains to, so is it common for us to use multiple ontologies? Sorry, Mark, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So
and I guess are there many people who can do it?
Oh, are there many people who can do it?
What is the job market for ontologists?
Well, clearly, again, like the gene ontology, and I think has provided or afforded so much tool development, software development. Many bioinformatics researchers are fundamentally familiar with that. We can use the gene ontology for enrichment analysis, all kinds of association analysis, all kinds of functions there. So there's plenty of tutorials and code and training material as to using an ontology like the gene ontology for biological data analysis. And similarly, I'd argue that probably in the healthcare domain, there's similar kinds of things that are being done for cohort analysis, risk analysis. Our colleague Nigam Shah does this kind of work on using ontologies for processing the notes of electronic healthcare records and subsequently doing analyses to look at cohorts and their the diseases and so on. I think it's mostly a matter of these use cases. In our work, where we look at multiple properties of for instance, drugs, stemming from the molecular to epidemiological, we're dealing with all kinds of terminologies. Upwards 20 different terminologies for one analysis, coupled with 10 to 15 different databases, and so on. So it becomes a pretty big project, but increasingly easier to do. We offer, for instance, another project that we do is called Bio-ontologies, where we have data in a uniform kind of representation using semantic web standards. You couple that with the ontologies, you vastly reduce the amount of work that you have to do to use those data, but it's up to you to think about the application that you want to pursue.
Great. What tools are available to identify ontology terms in literature?
Yeah, well, so I mean, I can tout here. So the NCBO, which Mark leads, has an annotator tool, so you can pick and choose the ontologies you want to use to do an annotation task. So that's very useful. I know there's a UI and API component. That's a real quick and dirty kind of way to start analyzing text that match the terms that you have in the ontology space. Again, the challenge is really worrying about potential false positives. A lot of terms, especially acronyms, have multiple different kinds of meanings. They're not unambiguous. They map to many different things. So I think the challenge with certainly text mining with ontologies is you have to really think about your use case. If you're interested in a large-scale analysis where you're not asking a question about any individual, then you should be able to find signal over noise, even if you don't do a great job of always being precise with your annotations. Now that doesn't always hold true for some kinds of diseases or procedures that you're looking at. You're using very common words, and then it's just practically impossible without some other corresponding information. There are other toolkits. Increasingly, we see also aspects to do some kind of deep learning over text to better extract or either identify entities or extract relations. Lots of work is being done there. But again, it's working with text is extremely challenging. And I think that there's plenty of work left to be done to improve the methods for good use of ontology over text.
What do you do with the situation when the ontology has to categorize an entity and it doesn't fit cleanly? A questioner asks, what do you do with aspirin when in one context it's a pain reliever, in another context it's a blood thinner? How do you answer simple questions like, what is this entity? How do you classify it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's actually one that we're struggling with right now as we use, we try to do a prediction of new drug indications. And a lot of these indications are drawn from actually text-mined annotations in which there are many, incorrect values. It's a very difficult problem. I think our approach is mostly that you can create, structures or knowledge structures that capture, for instance, the context in which some function or functionality is being executed. So again, if you want to articulate that aspirin can act as a potential blood thinner in some circumstance, then you really need the ontology or the description to do that. We have developed a tool called HiQ where we have this event-based representation where we sort of say, okay, what are the components in the event? What are the agents that, for instance, potentially cause change? And what's the biological context, or what's the circumstances under which this occurs? And so this kind of approach, this event-based representation, is also very prominent in other kinds of analyses, analytical analyses, but is not really prevalent in the way we currently construct ontologies. There's this modulation of the context, whether in space or in time or other interactions with other systems, is not often done. But increasingly, I think work that Monarch, Chris Mungle, Melissa Handel, Peter Robinson, and others are doing are also striving to capture this sort of information. So it's a little bit of provenance, a little bit of context, and I think an enhancement of the description of these functional circumstances that need to happen. So we do it in our work, but it's not prevalent, I think, in doing this. Even when you look at Uniprot, that captures these, again, these annotations of like I showed you for RAC1A functions, this kind of control only really, may happen under some circumstances and not others, and that's not necessarily detailed. What they'll tell you is what's the experimental evidence for the annotation that you see, but not necessarily the full context that you need to unambiguously interpret or understand in what context that's occurring.
Thanks, Michel. We have reached the end of the hour. The questions have been fantastic. We actually have many more questions that we could get to, but unfortunately we don't have the time. Let me thank you for your presentation, which was wonderful. And let me thank everybody who dialed in and everybody who will watch the replay of your talk online. And we'll have another session next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.